Okay, well, thank you all for joining us at this event. My name's Bill Leggett, and I'm a bookseller at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I wanted to encourage you to consider following us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many great events we're looking forward to is Jennifer Nasambuga Makumbi in conversation with Tayari Jones on Sunday, September 13th. They'll discuss the novel, A Girl is a Body of Water. But right now, we're happy to welcome Nancy Pearl and Jeff Schwager in conversation with Laurie Frankel about Nancy and Jeff's book, The Writer's Library, The Authors You Love and the Books That Changed Their Lives. A little bit about our conversation partners. Nancy Pearl regularly speaks about the importance and pleasure of reading at libraries, literary organizations, and community groups around the world. And you can hear her on NPR's Morning Edition and on KWGS-FM in Tulsa, Oklahoma, talking about her favorite books. Her monthly television show on the Seattle channel, Book Lust with Nancy Pearl, features interviews with authors, poets, and other literary figures. Among her many honors are the 2011 Librarian of the Year Award from Library Journal and the 2011 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association. And her novel, George and Lizzie, was published in 2017. Jeff Schwager is a writer, editor, producer, and playwright who has also had a successful career as an entertainment and media executive. In 2013, Book at Repertory Theater produced his acclaimed adaptation of Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son, and the following year, his dramatization of Michael Chabon's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay won the Theater Puget Sound's prestigious Gregory Award for Outstanding Production of 2014. And Nancy and Jeff are joined in conversation by Laurie Frankel, author of the novels The Atlas of Love, Goodbye for Now, This Is How It Always Is, winner of the Washington State Book Award, and coming in 2021, the novel 1, 2, 3. And this event will also include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. If someone's typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please consider upvoting that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. And most importantly, please consider supporting Nancy Pearl, Jeff Schwager, and Powell's by purchasing a copy of The Writer's Library. A link to buy the book will be shared in the chat. So Nancy, Jeff, and Laurie, it's an honor to welcome you all today, and thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful event.
Thank you, Bill.
Pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Bill. We're so excited to do this. I regret not being able to see you all, but I like to see your numbers. I'm so glad that you're out here. I wanted to show everybody the book in case you haven't seen it yet. It is a really satisfying book. It is really pleasant to hold. It smells really good. This is just exactly the kind of book that you should buy. Bill said you should buy one, and I actually think you should buy two because you're going to want to give one away because it's also a really good book to gift people because it's like the book for the readers in your life because it's about reading and writing and I feel like that's if the people to whom you would give books, this is the kind of book that they will love. So that's my argument. Buy two. I have read it. It is lovely. It is a book that I imagined sitting down and reading a little bit of every night, and then the first night I sat down and read the whole thing. So that's my fair warning to you to carve out some time. These two I could talk to forever and ever, and I have tons and tons of questions and lots of chatting to do. But I also want to assure everybody they give such good interview. They're so good at this. So it's going to be really great. We're going to get to it. But you should ask questions in the Q&A as we go, and I'll feed them to our panelists, and everything will be well, not everything will be answered, but hopefully many things will be answered. Yes. So just for starters, I wanted to start at the beginning because that's where you start with what inspired this project and where did it begin and and then how did it diverge from what you kind of imagined it would be at the start of it?
Well, Jeff, since this was all your idea, you begin answering that question.
Okay, well, I think this book began out of our friendship and our mutual love of talking about books and reading. And I met Nancy interviewing her for a project where she was being honored as a Washington State Agent of Change. And we hit it off.
Jewish agent of change.
Even better.
And we just hit it off, and we started hanging out and talking about books and all the books we loved in common. Are those my dogs?
No, unfortunately, it's mine. She'll shut up in a second.
All the books we loved in common, especially Sermons in Soda Water by John O'Hara. And my initial idea, well, I had this title in mind, The Writer's Library. And the idea was for a coffee table book, which would have photos of writers' actual libraries, and then short interviews with the writers about the books in their lives. And I asked Nancy if she would be interested in working on that with me. And she said she didn't think a coffee table book was her cup of tea, but that a book of interviews would be fun. And so I'll let Nancy take it from there.
And so I talked to my agent, and she said, no coffee table book. That is not your brand, Nancy. And she said, but a book of interviews would be absolutely wonderful. And so Jeff and I thought we would try out, we would see how it would work, and we would interview 3 people. Of course, our agent wanted 10 sample interviews. I said, we're not doing 10 sample interviews. We're doing 3 interviews. And so the first interview we did was with Jonathan Lethem, and that's the interview actually that opens the book, The Writer's Library. And he was in Seattle to do on book tour, and we met him in his hotel room. And really, we would have gone on talking to him for hours, and I think he would have been very happy to do that. But I am the timekeeper, and I knew he had to get ready for his presentation at Elliott Bay. So we did that interview, and then we interviewed somebody named Laurie Frankel, and again had just this fabulous conversation about you as a reader, and what that meant to you, and how being a reader from really a child and being read to by your parents, how that all kind of played into the wonderful writer that you are today, and the kind of empathetic writer that you are today. And then the third writer that we did, another Seattle writer, was Charles Johnson. And with those three very different writers, very different types of interviews, we saw how wonderful, Jeff and I saw, sort of got even more excited about how wonderful this project could be. And then our agent agreed, and actually the editor who bought the book for Harper One Books, a division of HarperCollins, was the same editor who had bought my novel George and Lizzie 3 years ago. So it was lovely, lovely, lovely to be working with her again. And then the hard part came, because we had to come up with a list of authors that we both wanted to interview. While Jeff and I share a great love of really several to many writers, I think, beginning with John O'Hara, and our favorite is Sermons in Soda Water. We totally, that's the book that we want everybody to read because we love it so much. We each made a list of authors that we would love to interview, and the ones that we had in common were people like Michael Chabon, Ayelet Waldman, Donna Tartt, Lori Moore, who we just couldn't get for this book, which was very sad for us. Laila Lalami had just come out with a book, Viet Thanh Nguyen. I do this television show in Seattle where I've interviewed over the years, the many years since 2004, a lot of writers, including you, Laurie, and including Charles Johnson there too. But we had a little bit of of a way to get to those authors. And you know, our disagreements about writers, Jeff and my disagreements about writers, they never come to fisticuffs. I can say, Jeff, I think you would agree, they can become very heated.
Occasionally.
Occasionally, right.
Yes.
And did you know all along that you were going to interview in person? You were going to interview people in person. Why was that so important?
Well, Jeff is a very nosy person. And that he wanted, his idea was to see these writers' libraries. And so by golly, he was not giving up that desire to see those writers' libraries.
I'm a book collector as well, so I love books.
Well, we all love books.
Yes.
That's here. But we don't all collect books. That's true. So, so the majority of the writers in the book they were so generous and asked us, you know, put us into their homes. In many cases, fed us. We drank many a cup of tea with these writers, from Amor Tolls to I think to Laila Lalami. We had tea at her from New York to California. And really being with them, I think, gave us, it gives the interviews a very different feel. And a lot of people have said that, you know, that they feel like they're there too. You know, Tom Boyle, the interview with T.C. Boyle, although we feel we can call him Tom.
Yeah, you've earned it.
Right. Yeah. And Jeff, why don't you talk about Tom's? Oh
yes, well, Tom's house was the house that I most wanted to see because it was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and it's in Montecito, and it was the first Frank Lloyd Wright house west of the Mississippi, and I was just very eager to check out a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And Tom Boyle is a writer that I have been reading. I remember getting the short story collection Greasy Lake when I was in college, I think. And he and I are actually from neighboring towns in New York. I was born in Poughkeepsie and he grew up in Peekskill, New York. And he's a writer I have a great attachment to, and was really eager to see his Frank Lloyd Wright home. And we got to, and because of the way Frank Lloyd Wright designed houses, there's not just like one room that has the books in it. They're scattered throughout the house, and we followed Tom on a sort of walking tour of his house with the tape recorder going, talking about books along the way and seeing all the wonderful books he had. And the one that stood out for me, Nancy can talk about some others, was The Maples Stories by John Updike, which is an Updike book that both Nancy and I love. And Updike, of course, was a huge O'Hara fan, being from the same part of the country as John O'Hara. And Joe Biden is also, by the way, from that very same part of the country, Scranton, the coal portion of Pennsylvania.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yes. Did you find that the interviews that you did in people's houses, when you had access to their libraries to look at, were different than the interviews that you did with people when they were on book tour, not in their home, not with their library, not with their books?
I'd like to look. Could I just start by saying that Laurie Frankel is the only writer who gave me a book off of her shelf.
I was going to ask that. It seems like everybody would have sent you home with books. Everyone who comes into my house leaves with books because otherwise they take over.
Actually, that's not true. Tom Boyle did give us each copies of his books.
Right.
He actually had boxes of his own books, and he signed copies of 2 of his books for each of us. But you, Laurie, gave me a copy of a book that I was just admiring on your bookshelf, Henderson the Rain King by Saul Bellow.
Take it with you.
Gave it back.
No, I didn't give it back. I emailed Laurie and offered to give it back, and she told me to keep it.
Oh, I apologize.
Well, and in fact, he did offer, but what I said was pass it on to someone else because because Nancy Pearl has taught me well, which is it might not be the book for you right now, but it's the book for someone sometime, and therefore you have to find that person.
But I've kept it, and it's my plan in life to try every 10 years
Okay.
to read Henderson the Rain King, because it might not be the right book for me today, but maybe in 10 years. But I'll let Nancy answer the rest of that question about what it was like to be in people's homes versus not.
In some ways, it was the kind of thing that, you know, readers, when we go into somebody's house, what do we look at first? We look at what books they have on the shelf. And if they have similar books that you have, or books that you love, then you know you can be friends with them.
Yeah.
And so there was that kind of connection. Tom Boyle, for example, had a copy, Tom Boyle and Viet Thanh Nguyen both had a copy of the big novel by Bob Shikoshius called The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, which I think is one of the great, it was a finalist for the Pulitzer, but nobody's read it.
No.
And it is just an amazing, amazing book. And you know, to see that it was on Tom's shelf and on Viet's shelf, again, two such different writers coming from different backgrounds, both loving that book. You know, you kind of feel closer to people who have those similar books.
Although interestingly, Tom and Viet are friends. They both taught at USC, and Viet tweeted a photo of Tom today. Is that right? No, Tom tweeted a photo and Viet liked it. That's what it was. Yeah, I really enjoyed Amor Towles's. He has the quintessential writer's study. It's just this dark wood shelves, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and one thing that I loved about it was that he had a section of Bob Dylan books, which I also have. And then he also, behind glass, had some signed and very old first editions, and that was wonderful to see.
Yeah.
Did people want to show you did people talk much about what they read as children? Because I can imagine that those books kind of fell off of their shelves, not literally, but, you know, got migrated off of their shelves.
Well, you know, Jeff and I went into this project without a list of questions that we wanted to ask every author. I mean, you know, we went into it believing that we wanted these conversations to be organic and to develop from the way the author was responding. And so we begin each interview with usually me saying, were you a reader as a child? Or, you know, were your parents readers? Or where did this all begin? And then we would just go wherever the writer wanted to take us. And with an author like Maza Mengistu from Ethiopia, it took us from her first setting foot on the American, you know, in America, in a small town in Colorado, and seeing snow. Do you remember, Jeff, seeing snow for the first time? And, you know, the teachers who really welcomed her to the country, and that kind of experience. And so a lot of the writers, you know, all the writers have gotten their as a gift a copy of the book. And we got a note from Jonathan Lethem saying that he had read his interview and he felt that it really explained who he was much truer to who he really was than a lot of other interviews are. And I think that's because, Jeff, do you agree? Because we approached, because we were talking about them as readers, and of course they're writers too, but we weren't talking about their books. We were talking about books that had meant so much to them.
Yeah. And we weren't asking questions about their lives. We weren't saying, you know, tell us about your relationship with this person or that person. We were asking them about books, but other things would naturally come up. They would talk about, like Louise Erdrich is a great example, where his reading life was formed by the fact that he grew up between Tijuana, where he was born, and San Diego, where he moved when he was a young child, and how his father was Mexican and his mother was American. And there was this culture clash in his home between Spanish literature and English literature. And, you know, we didn't ask that. We asked him what had he read, and that came out of it. So when Jonathan said, this is a great portrait of who I am, it's a portrait of who he is, because who he is what he's read.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are the questions that people want to answer. I want to sit and talk about. I wait for people to ask me what they should read, and you know, what I've read, and those are very interesting, formative questions. But it also so thoroughly informs what you write. Those things are really like all of a person.
And I think that the connections between writers who don't know each other, or certainly who aren't friends, but who approach reading in somewhat the same way. I mean, I remember, Laurie, I think from when I first met you and we were talking, you said how you choose books to read really based on what you're working on at that moment. So if you're working on a book, like your new book, 1, 2, 3, which I've had the privilege of reading, and it's wonderful, it's told from multiple viewpoints. And what you were reading when we interviewed you were as many books as you could find that were from multiple viewpoints. And then Russell Banks said basically the same thing. Russell Banks was working on a novel when we talked to him in Saratoga Springs, New York, and he said he's rereading Tolstoy novella, which everybody should read if they haven't read, in English. I'm not going to, push the Russian, but he said he was reading that because there's something in his new novel that made him remember how Tolstoy, he wanted to see how Tolstoy had handled a similar situation. And,
right.
that kind of story that we heard from different writers about what books mean in their lives as writers, in addition to as readers, was really, really fascinating.
Yeah, Jennifer Egan was another one who talked about, she's currently working on a book set in 19th century New York. And so that's what she's reading, are books about 19th century New York. She's a huge Edith Wharton fan to begin with. So she's kind of working back from there. And I remember you, Nancy, bringing up Mrs. Trollope.
Yes, Fanny Trollope's, the mother of Anthony Trollope's, wrote a book called I believe it's called The Domestic Manners of the Americans, because she took a trip through the United States earlier in the 19th century than Edith Wharton. Edith Wharton is a lot later, but
nonfiction.
Yeah, nonfiction. Yep.
I'm just going to take notes while you keep going. You're great. I'm going to take notes.
Yeah, and Jennifer had also, her previous book, Manhattan Beach, had been set in New York during the World War II era. And so she had been reading books that were set in New York in that era. And she lives in New York, of course. And so that was, we talked about those books. The one that immediately sticks in my mind, of course, is Butterfield 8 by John O'Hara, which is kind of a seminal book set in New York in the 30s, right before the war. And she talked about what a big influence that book was. And it turned out that book also influenced Amor Towles in writing Rules of Civility. So connections.
And then you must have found the opposite too. People who want to read things that have nothing to do with what they're writing.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was going to follow up on the Jenny Egan, our interview with her, was that she has her books arranged. You know, that's always so interesting about how one arranges one's own personal library.
Right.
And Jenny Egan has her books arranged in clumps of what books she was reading when she was working on particular books. So A Visit from the Goon Squad, there are those books that were important to her during that, you know, the writing of that book. So I think that was one of the very interesting things, was how people arrange their books.
Yes. How do you both arrange your books?
Jeff?
Well, you know, they started out alphabetical by author and, you know, fiction, poetry, drama.
Very
film.
civilized.
I have a lot of film books, you know, some sort of classical bookstore, but they're now just, there's kind of a second layer of just a pure mess on top of that very neat layer that began the project of my book life as a reader. Nancy?
Oh, mine are arranged. I'm a librarian. Mine are arranged in very loose alphabetical order, and they're in 3 different rooms in our small, very narrow house. So like A through G, bookshelves in the bedroom, and then H through R or S are in the living room, and then T through Z. But it's all just a mush, you know, just a mush.
And I have hinted to Nancy that I could really use a librarian to come to my house and help me organize my books, but she doesn't seem to catch that hint.
I feel like as soon as quarantine is over, you've earned it.
I think I've been making that hint since before quarantine began.
Oh, I see.
I don't think it's going to happen, but
yeah, maybe not.
if there are any other librarians out there listening who want to volunteer.
Yeah, I think we could find you a wonderful library school student at the information school at the University of Washington who would be delighted to come in and arrange your books and, you know, and catalog them for you. But you'd have to pay.
Well, it would be worth it. I'm sure my wife would happily pay for that.
Well, and it's an interesting question how that hadn't occurred to me, but of course that's true, that your reading gets clumped by what you're writing. And so if you're not writing anything, then your books become a giant mess. So the reason to be a productive writer becomes like, so your house is not a mess. It's a really good idea. Did you start to find that you could predict, like you knew the answers that people were going to have to the questions based on what they've written, like having read what they've written before you showed up at their house, that you know what the answers to the questions are? You know what kind of readers they're going to be, I guess.
Can I tell you, two interesting answers to that question are yes and no. With Jennifer Egan, there's a book of hers that Nancy and I both love, Look at Me. And in reading that, I wanted to ask her what she was reading when she wrote it. And I sensed that Don DeLillo was the primary influence on that. And that was indeed her answer. With Amor Tolls and Rules of Civility, a book set in 1930s New York about a man who reinvents his identity at a young age and become someone else. I just assumed that The Great Gatsby would be the primary influence on that book. And he said that had never occurred to him. And no, it wasn't. So those are the two that leap out to me. Nancy?
Well, I guess I would say that in general, no. I couldn't predict what books would be on what books these writers would want to talk about, or what books were so important to them. And, you know, I'm thinking about our interview with Dave Eggers, who said, in fact, and this we did in the McSweeney's offices, the literary magazine that or the publishing literary place that he has. across from 826, the original Valencia, 826 Valencia, the original one of those. And he brought, because we weren't at his house, he brought a pile of books that had meant a lot to him. But he said, you know, I would expect, you know, knowing all the literary stuff that Dave Eggers did, I mean, that he wrote that wonderful, I felt wonderful memoir for his first book. And then went on to write. So, you know, he writes fast and he writes well, and he's always busy, and he's just really, you know, a wonderful guy. But he said, no, he wasn't a reader. He was a little bit dyslexic, he thinks. And it wasn't until he was in high school and somehow came upon the book Dune by Frank Herbert, a sort of important science fiction novel to many people, that it turned him into a reader. And he said, you know, he was reading that book, and for a few days there he was in Dune. And that's, you know, that's the joy of science fiction and fantasy, is that I mean, the most important thing, it seems to me, about science fiction and fantasy novels, which I love, is the world building. And the way it takes you out of where you are, and you know, you're in this fully developed world. And for Dave Eggers, that's what Dune did for him. But I wouldn't have thought that. You know,
no, because that's not what he writes.
Right.
Mostly, yeah. He's an interesting case because he's such a good reader and he's such a good writer, but he's also such a good literary citizen and sort of general citizen, frankly. He does a lot of really great activism. How much did you talk with authors about things they do besides reading and writing? Like, that is, how much did the conversation open up to these other aspects?
I would say not very much. I think
because we're obsessive. We're an obsessive sort.
The writer for whom I think that was the truest was Siri Hustvedt. And you know, Siri Hustvedt is this brilliant woman who just writes these fabulous novels. And The Blazing World is another novel that if anyone hasn't read, The Blazing World is just, you know, when it's described, people tend to say it's a feminist novel about a woman artist, but it's so big that just saying it that way doesn't do it much justice. But Siri works with psychiatrists and she teaches, and in the course of talking about her reading, all of those things came into it. And remember, Jeff, and it was just the hottest day in the world, and here we were in Brooklyn, and Siri was cool and blonde and gorgeous, and just a wonderful reader and just a wonderful person. And she and Paul Auster aren't they the founders of Writers Against Trump? So, you know, she's a good citizen of the world as well, not to offend anybody who's on the other side.
No.
Yeah, and a couple of other writers who we did branch out with were Maza Mengiste and Laila Lalami, where we talked about their upbringings in other countries. So you'll see if you read the book that the interview with Maza begins with talking about her life in Ethiopia before she came to America, and how Ethiopia has more of an oral tradition. And her parents weren't actually readers, they were storytellers. And Laila talks a lot about growing up in Morocco in sort of French colonial, under the French colonial thumb, I guess you might say, and how that shaped her early life and early reading experiences. And that's was a fascinating thing to learn. And that sort of led to our asking about Paul Bowles, the author who, I believe, was he an American author or an English author? I don't know.
American.
He is American, yeah. Who relocated and spent most of his life in Morocco. And sort of, we spent some time talking about how Paul Bowles lived in Morocco for 40 years, and Laila felt he never understood the people at all.
Yeah.
that he was living among.
And the other things that I think these interviews did that I hope comes through in the book is that it expanded our reading lists, mine and Jeff's, just exponentially. And so what we did at the end of every interview is pull out about a dozen books that the authors talked about most lovingly. So you can really get it's a way to, to say, if you love Jennifer Egan's novels, here are her favorite books and nonfiction.
That's right. Get House of Mirth by Edith Wharton if you love Jennifer Egan.
That's the book for you. Well, this is, so here's a weird question, but you only interviewed writers whose writing you loved, or at least one of you loved, probably both of you, loved. How often did people name books that you really did not love? Like, never mind books you hadn't read, but books where you think like, oh, that book is terrible. And, which is a really strange thing. Like, this book so influenced me to write this book that you did love, but you hated that book.
Wow, what a good question.
Yeah. I can say that I never read children's books. So throughout the time that the authors were talking about children's books, I was adrift.
What did you do when you were a child?
I started reading Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie. I did read Encyclopedia Brown. I just had a thing for mysteries from a very early age.
Wow.
And so when Michael Chabon talked about how much he loved Encyclopedia Brown, Jeff, who was kind of snoozing, perked up.
That's true. It's true. Saul Bellow is a writer who I have never been able to get. And so when writers, you asked, we talked about Henderson the Rain King. When writers talked about Bellow books that they loved, I didn't love them, those particular books. One book of his I liked was Humboldt's Gift, I guess. But I did sort of want to listen to what they were saying. And I guess Herzog is the book that seems to resonate the most for people. And I have not read Herzog. I have tried Henderson the Rain King many times. And the reason that particular book, by the way, is because Jack Nicholson had always wanted to make a movie of it. And so I was always curious of what Jack Nicholson saw in it. Bellow was somebody who people talked about. Who else did people talk about that we didn't love, Nancy?
Well, every time there was I'm going to switch the answer a little bit. Every time there was like a lapse in the conversation, or every time somebody would stop to take a breath, Jeff would jump in, his two favorite writers. So, and one of those is Philip Roth, and the other is Dennis Johnson. So, and I have to say, I've loved many. I've loved some of Philip Roth's books a lot. But Dennis Johnson, for me, is just too violent, or too rough, or too, even his short stories, they're too desperate or something.
Yeah.
So, when Jeff went off on the Dennis Johnson kicks, I have to say, I would,
I would get kicked.
Right, exactly.
But it was joyful for me when people loved Dennis Johnson, like Louise Erdrich loved Train Dreams, his very short novel, which was one of his last books. And Jennifer Egan loved Jesus' Son, which is a book that I adapted for the stage and is one of my favorite books ever. And many other people also loved Jesus' Son.
They did.
Yeah, and in fact, T.C. Boyle mentioned Fiscadoro,
right,
which is a book that I don't particularly like by Dennis Johnson. But he talked about that being a hugely influential book for him. So, that was very interesting. And of course, everyone pretty much loved Roth. to a greater or lesser degree.
Yes.
I sent Susan Choi off to a used bookstore the day after our interview to buy a copy of Roth's last novel, Nemesis, which she ended up loving. And we talked to her the other day about that. So that was really satisfying.
Did anybody talk about books that they really didn't like? And sometimes those are very influential. I often read books that I don't necessarily love, but that are just very influential, that teach me all sorts of useful things for writing.
Well, I think Madeline Miller, author of Circe and Song of Achilles, we had a long, very interesting, great discussion about King Lear and John Updike, and especially the witches of Eastwick. And Madeline, who grew up as the daughter of an early feminist, very strong feminist mom, talked about how offensive she found John Updike's attitudes toward women, and which I agreed with her, because the Witches of Eastwick is, I find just, I mean, a lot of John Updike are not my favorite books. But Jeff said, well, what about King Lear? King Lear talks about women. Remember, Jeff, you brought up?
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Yeah. And what did she say to you?
She said that Lear was talking in character about women, whereas she felt that Updike was talking as the narrator about women.
Yeah.
You know, so the fact that the character Lear says offensive things about women is perfectly in keeping with his character, but that Updike was injecting his authorial views of women, which she found very, very offensive.
Interesting.
And you know who else came up frequently with several of the writers, at least, was Ursula Le Guin.
Oh, sure.
How important Ursula Le Guin was in their lives, whether it was just because they had loved the Wizard of Earthsea books, or her, you know, her adult short stories, or her memoir, the last book that she wrote, or for Louise Erdrich. Ursula Le Guin was a real mentor, a really important person in his life who got his first publication, who recommended that this essay that he wrote be published. And she gave Louise this, you know, she called him Luisito. You know, you must, and I can't even remember if this is in the interview or not, if we kept it in the interview.
It is.
He would say, do not write that women stand in front of the mirror and look at their breasts. They don't. You know, and I mean, the interview with Louise was just, in their own way, I have to say, every single interview was just the most fun ever. And there was a lot of laughter in all of the interviews. And, you know, I hope that kind of warmth comes through. And, you know, I remember when we interviewed Richard Ford in Maine, and he said, he was talking about the Moviegoer by Walker Percy, that he had been asked to write an introduction to the Moviegoer. And I said, you know, that had been, when I was about 18, my very favorite book, because I so identified with the main character of the novel, who was about 18 and was extremely depressed, and I was 18 and extremely depressed. And that novel meant so much to me. And then I read it, and he was just amazed that I had read it when I was 18, and that it meant so much to me. And then I said, you know, I read it again about 30 years later, and it didn't do anything for me. It was the saddest experience of rewriting, because I wasn't that person anymore. And I kept wanting to reach into the book and shake Kate, her name is, I think, you know, and say, come on, you know, get a grip. But just sharing that kind of thing that
Yeah.
was really special.
It comes across. That is the overwhelming feeling about reading this, is that it's sitting around talking about books with people who love books. You do such a beautiful job of letting the conversation go where it will, and it really comes across. It is a delightful read about reading, and you can't ask for anything more than that.
Good, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
We're gonna have some questions. If people have more questions, we will we'll answer. Well, we'll try to answer them. So, okay, here we go. This is a good question, an interesting one, which is, did you interview anyone who wasn't included in the book? And were there, like, people who didn't make the cut? You don't have to name names. And were there any interviews that went sideways? And in fact, Nancy has asked in a good way or a bad way.
There were no interviews that we didn't include in the book. And I've interviewed a whole bunch of writers in my time, and certainly I've interviewed writers whose books I will never be able to read again because they were so unpleasant in one way or another.
Oh my God.
And it's always, for me, it's always so scary to meet a writer whose books you admire and find that, I mean, everybody's in a bad mood sometime, and you could understand that and all of that, but I don't know. But of these 23 writers, I think I ended up liking all of them even more than I had going into the project.
Yeah.
What?
I have to say, I've interviewed many writers as well, not as many as Nancy. I don't think I've ever interviewed an author who I didn't come out of the interview liking, actually. I have had interviews with people who I came out not liking, but they weren't writers.
Yeah.
I used to interview a lot of people in Hollywood, actors and directors, and I would come out of a lot of those interviews feeling like this is not a person I would want to spend time with. But writers seem to me, at least the ones who agree to do interviews, to be the sort of people I like.
Yeah.
There's a question here under the chat, which I have up,
Okay.
and it was somebody said, I loved the Susan Orlean's intro. How did that come about?
Great question.
So Jeff and I, Susan Orlean was high on both of our lists, and we really wanted to interview Susan for the book. And we could never, when we were on the East Coast interviewing people, she was on the West Coast. When we were on the West Coast interviewing people, she was on the East Coast. And so we could never, we never could connect at all. And then I think it was Jeff who said, let's ask her to do the introduction because she's such a wonderful writer. And I think that, and she graciously agreed to do it, but said that she was really looking forward to talking to us. Do you remember Jeff talking to us about books? And so maybe that would happen someday, but we were just thrilled to get the introduction, which I think sets up the whole book in just a wonderful way.
Yeah, I mean, especially coming off her having written the library book, which is a book Nancy and I both loved. It just seemed like a natural to have her be the person who would introduce this book.
Yeah, and she did such a beautiful job. Yeah. Somebody is wondering, departed authors you would have interviewed if they had not been departed.
Well, I think we know who number one on the list is.
Either Dennis Johnson or Philip Roth. Which would you do first, Jeff?
Oh, Philip Roth, definitely, yeah. I've actually interviewed Dennis Johnson, not for this project, but did have the chance to interview him back when Jesus' Son was being written, the stories were being written and published in the New Yorker. Philip Roth, I never had the chance to interview, and he would certainly be at the top of my list. Nancy?
I think I would have liked to have interviewed, I mean, I know I would have loved to have interviewed Ursula Le Guin.
Yeah.
who I was lucky enough to have lunch with and to talk about books with. And I just have to tell this. When I was early in my library career, I was a children's librarian, and her book, The Wizard of Earthsea, came out, and School Library Journal asked me to review the book because I was doing reviews for School Library Journal at that time, which children's librarians do. And I loved that book. I wrote this glowing review and said, this is how Gandalf in, The Lord of the Rings was trained. And, it was just such a wonderful, wonderful book. But that was, I don't even want to say how many years ago it was, but it was like half a lifetime ago that I wrote that review. And then I was having lunch with her in Seattle. She was here visiting a friend, and the friend and another science fiction writer, and the friend invited me to come to lunch. And when I sat down, I said very shyly, I reviewed The Wizard of Earthsea for School Library Journal, and I just loved it. And she said, oh, I know you did. In a very she knew exactly, could probably quote from that review. So that's my Ursula Le Guin story. So I would have loved to have interviewed her. We both really wanted to interview Alice Munro, who is still living but isn't well. I think Toni Morrison is somebody that we both would have just given almost anything to interview, but she was ill, and we couldn't interview her.
In terms of writers who are no longer with us, of course, John O'Hara would have been on the list.
Right.
And I know I was really interested in interviewing playwrights, Nancy less so. So people like Arthur Miller, who died a few years back, I would have loved to have interviewed him. Bill Shakespeare is somebody I would have loved to have interviewed who's no longer with us. I'm sure you would too, Laurie.
Yes, I would. I absolutely, definitely have some questions.
Yeah.
Somebody wants to ask about transcription, how these conversations went from out of our mouths to into a book, which is a good and hard question.
Yeah, so the transcription was for me, one of the hardest parts of the whole project. It is hell to transcribe from, these digital machines. And after we tried transcribing the first 3 and just getting, I just sort of, we couldn't quite figure out how to do it. Should Jeff listen to it and do a transcription, and then I would do the same, and we would compare the transcriptions. I mean, it was just impossible. But it was the Charles Johnson interview that for some reason almost did me in. I mean,
no offense, Chuck.
No offense, Chuck. It wasn't his problem, it was my problem. But then Erica Bauermeister, I happened to be interviewing her, talking to her, and telling her how much I could not do these transcriptions. And she said, well, I know someone who might be her son's girlfriend who works at a bookstore in Seattle, Finney Books, might be interested in taking on that job. And Annika Miller did a fabulous job for us. I mean, really, the book would not have ever been done, ever been published. Not for her doing those transcriptions.
Yes. Okay. Yes, it is. It's hard. I feel like writers talk really quickly because it's so freeing to not have to pick the right words. It's just such a different thing than the keyboard or the pen. You let people talk out loud, and then there's no shutting us up, really. It is 5 of, and I'm mindful of people's time, but somebody would love if you pitched Sermons in Soda Water, which is a really good question. This is not a book that I think most people have read, and you both love it so much. We could maybe end by your telling us a little bit about that, and anything else you've read lately that you want to pitch.
Well, first, I'd like to just, for the sake of Powell's, I would like to say that it is perhaps out of print. Powell's may have a used copy of it, but it's 3 novellas that were originally published in a slipcase, each one individually.
Ooh.
But all of those novellas are in a book that's in print called The Novellas of John O'Hara. So if once you hear about it from us, you want to read it, the place to read it is The Novellas of John O'Hara. And Nancy, do you want to take this one or shall I?
You can, but you have to be mindful of the time.
Yes, well, I'll be quick because I did just reread it 2 weekends ago. It's 3 novellas. They're all told from the point of view of a narrator named Jim Malloy, who is very autobiographical. And they're just very concerned with kind of the world of the early 30s as seen from the viewpoint of around 1960. So they're retrospective. They're very character driven, and they're just the experiences that this man, Jim Malloy, has. One of them is set on an estate in New York. One of them involves a sort of second-rate movie star and her affair with an industrialist. One involves, a couple of them involve people in this town, Gibbsville, which is based on his hometown of Pottsville, O'Hara's hometown, which is very near Scranton, where Joe Biden is from.
Wait, somebody.
I'm sorry?
You have to read the chat because somebody pointed out something about where they were from. But I just want to say that it's the voice of Jim Malloy, I think, that carries those novellas and really puts you, it's an older man looking back on really his young manhood, as a young man. And for some reason they just, have stuck with both me and Jeff for all those years. And I just have to say 2 books two brand new books that are perfect for lighthearted novels that I think I just had a great time reading both of them. The first one is called Set My Heart to 5 by Simon Stevenson, yes, which is about a bot and who's trying to make a movie to show that bots have just as much empathy as humans do. It's really a wonderful novel. The other one is called Hench, Hench, and it's by, the author's last name is Walschatz. And it's, how the good guys, superheroes have sidekicks like Batman has Robin, and bad guys have henchmen. And this young woman is a hench to a very bad guy. But her big talent is spreadsheets and big data and cost benefit analyses. And so she does this cost benefit analysis to show that even though, these superheroes are saving people or saving the city, the wreck that they leave behind, costs a lot of money in both life and in, cold hard cash. So they decide, this hench and her boss decide they are going to bring down the superhero. I mean, they're just great fun. They're not going to change the world. They're just, for me, they were perfect for this time that we're living through.
Yes, I love this. That is exactly what the world needs now. And fabulous news to everybody. You can buy these books and more at Powell City of Books. You have this, one of the world's greatest bookstores right here. So I have to encourage everyone to buy this book, and then like all of the other books that have been mentioned this evening and all of the other books that are herein. It's just a really wonderful list of, books to read, among other things. And this is really the place to do this. So I have to thank Powell's for having us, but also encourage everybody to go there, either in person or online, and buy lots of books.
And thank you, Laurie, for shepherding us through this hour. We're so appreciative.
It is my absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Laurie.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Powell's.
Well, thank you all. And just a note, it looks like during the course of your event, we sold out of your book.
Oh,
So congratulations, congratulations for that, and our apologies for anyone who clicked on the link and then couldn't get it. We'll get it back in very soon, and you can buy it then. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this event at Powell's, and it was a pleasure to host Nancy Pearl, Jeff Schwager, and Laurie Frankel. Please consider purchasing a copy of the Writer's Library when we have some more by visiting us at powells.com. And while you're there, please be sure to check out our lineup of other upcoming virtual events. And we look forward to seeing you at one. So Nancy, Jeff, and Laurie, thanks again. We're very grateful, and thank you, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.